We're going to take a look at chapters 23 and 24 of the book of Acts. And in that section, we can see that Jesus as our coach is complicated. Because it put the Apostle Paul in a really bad situation. And it often puts us in a tenuous or difficult situation. Because Paul communicated his belief to the city of Jerusalem, which Coach Lasso talked about last week, Paul was nearly killed. In fact, things got so bad that they had to call in the Roman army. And Paul was nearly whipped for what went on, and found himself between two entities. He found himself between the faith of his family in the Sanhedrin, and he found himself between the power and might of the greatest superpower the world had ever known, Rome. So in the midst of this middle space, in the literal middle of those two chapters, in Acts 23:11, amidst this rock and this hard place, Jesus came to Paul, and he said to him, everything's going to turn out for the best. That's okay. Courage. You go to the next one. Yeah. It's going to be all right. Everything's going to turn out for the best. You've been a good witness for me in Jerusalem. Now you're going to be my witness in Rome. Yay? We'll talk more about what happened when he got there. Just leave that up. Because this is not necessarily good news. Because Paul now finds himself between a rock and a hard place. Between Jerusalem and Rome. For the past many years, probably 15 to 20 years, Paul had been on a great mission, a great journey. He'd been preaching the gospel. He'd been changing lives. He'd been bringing new life. And now he's going to be between two powers that are going to seek to control him. Do we not find ourselves in similar spaces? Between powers that want to control us. Between moments. Between powers, between faith. Between politics and media and what's right and what's wrong. Between what's funny and what's no longer funny, between our family, between our friends, between the CDC and LA County Health. And we are perplexed, are we not? We know all of these things have a huge influence on our lives. They have a huge influence on our hope, upon our happiness. And we know that they are not always sympathetic to our desire to live courageously with Jesus, to stand with him, to testify, and to be a good witness for him. It's where we find ourselves. In Acts chapter 22, a Roman officer called a tribune, everybody say tribune. Tribune was a rank of office, and he perceived that this riot that was going on from Paul preaching to the city of Jerusalem was going to go badly. I've never seen a riot that's gone well, but there you go. He rightly saw the root of this riot as religious in nature. And I don't know what you know about religious riots, but they are among the worst that there are. He was going to have Paul flogged, but then Paul communicated to him that he was a Roman citizen. And with a Roman citizenship, the tribune had to take his life seriously and had to protect it. Now, this Roman tribune rightly decided that since it was a religious situation, that what he should do is take him to church, right? Let the church sort it out. So they took him to the Sanhedrin, or the Jewish ruling council, sort of like a Supreme Court made up of a whole bunch of people to talk about laws and rules and how they should conduct their lives. As Paul stood before the Sanhedrin, they perceived that he was indeed a lawbreaker. And the high priest Ananias ordered Paul to be struck in the mouth. And yet by this, he too was breaking the law. Because a Jewish law says this. A Jewish law says this. When you strike the cheek of an Israelite, it is like you are striking God. Not good. Not good. Now, Paul, knowing this law, knowing this rule, knowing that he wasn't a lawbreaker, as you can imagine, didn't react well. So what does he do? Does he go, high priest, please, you've misunderstood and you have broken the law? No, he calls him a whitewashed tomb. And we're off. Jerusalem, Rome. Rock, hard place. Jets and sharks. The humiliation of a face slap and the faux pas of calling good church folks whitewashed tombs aside, both Jerusalem and Rome held pretty high sway over Paul's life. At his core, Paul respected religion. He respected political leadership. He was no anarchist. He was a Roman citizen, and he was a trained Pharisee. In fact, in Romans 13, he writes this. He says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Unlike many of us today, Paul could hold two complicated things like this together. Respecting a particular office, and what do we do when that particular office, that particular structure becomes unjust? He could hold those two things together. Paul preached, and our faith teaches, that God gives authority to the governing structures. But authority is given for the purpose of providing foundational peace and justice. Because if the governing authority abrogates that responsibility, the bad guys are always going to win, right? So, our respect for those structures shouldn't negate our duty to call them to account. There is a rich tradition in the faith community, and especially amongst the Judeo-Christian community in this country, of calling out our political leaders, our leaders, when they get into trouble. There is a whole mechanism for pastors in the Presbyterian Church that if I fall prey or Adam falls prey to one of the great sins of the Presbyterian of the church, those things of either sleeping with the secretary or the music director, stealing money from the church, or creating some sort of a cult, which we pastors, we let this stuff go to our head. That's the sort of thing that happens. There is a whole mechanism for dealing with that your session knows about. We have a great tradition in this country of holding people to account. And Paul has no problem holding these ideas together. He has no compulsion about calling God's people back to God's justice. He has no compulsion about centering things back on God, and he does this, are you ready? By throwing resurrection gasoline onto the fire. In verse 6, he says this. He says, noticing both Sadducees and Pharisees were present, Paul called out, hey, I too am a Pharisee. Now stop and think about it. Aren't I on trial for something we both believe? The hope of resurrection? Now you're probably thinking, well, that's as clear as mud. But there's something at work here that we probably don't see. You got to think back to the call about what you know about Sadducees and Pharisees. Okay? Pharisees grounded ultimate justice in the future. Pharisees believed that God would set everything right in the future when he returned, and he would restore all things, he would make a new creation and raise the dead. The Sadducees shared no such belief, and they grounded justice in the now. Pharisees in the future with the resurrection, Sadducees in the now. And Paul confronted both groups by knowingly tossing a match of resurrection, i.e., God being in charge, onto this tinderbox. Jerusalem and Rome, rock and hard place, jets and sharks, frying pan and fire. The Roman guard witnessed this looming conflagration, and he decided to spirit Paul away. But he still wasn't safe, because a group of 40 men vowed not to eat or to drink until they had killed Paul. Providentially, Paul's nephew, who we don't know his name, heard about this and warned the tribune, who was named Claudius Lysis, about the plot. And Claudius decided to place Paul into protective custody and take him to the Roman governor, who lived about 60 miles northwest of Jerusalem, at Caesarea Maritima, or Caesar's house by the sea. Jerusalem, Rome. Rock, hard place. Jets, sharks. Frying pan, fire. Devil, deep blue sea. The Tribune said, prepare to leave for Caesarea by 9 tonight with the deployment of, get this, 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. Take Paul safely to the governor. And suddenly the full power of the Roman army, which up to that moment was going to have him flogged, was mustered to rescue Paul. Their mission, keep this citizen of Rome alive and safe. Paul was a prisoner and a Roman citizen. He had rights. The guards who were readying the lash now became his protectors. The plotters, who vowed not to eat until they had killed Paul, realized that lunch was going to be postponed. Jerusalem, Rome, rock, hard place, a man and his lunch. So 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen. No one ever accused Rome of subtlety. They may not have known exactly what the fuss was all about, but soldiering is about doing, not knowing. And doing is what the army does best. The governor, to whom Paul was taken, was named Felix. No, not that one. That one. Not that one. That one. By this time, Felix was reaching into his bag of tricks. By the time Paul was brought into the court, Felix had governed Judea for 5 years, and he governed Samaria in the north for 2 years prior. In 2 more years, he would have been able to retire to live a life of privilege. But wait, there's more. Felix was born a slave. Family connections with Nero influenced his career. He moved out of slavery and then became the first slave to ever become a Roman governor. Felix understood the importance of family values. He married 3 princesses in succession, one of whom turned out to be a great-granddaughter of Antony and Cleopatra. Yeah. He knew family values, or at least he knew the value of a family. And yet, for all of his populist backstory, he was unscrupulous. He was capable of murdering his closest supporters, even a Jewish high priest. It was to this guy that Paul was brought to stand trial. Jerusalem and Rome, rock and hard place, a man and his lunch, truth and justice. Soon, Ananias, some elders, and their lawyer arrived at Caesarea to present their case. And following a nauseatingly flowery opening, where they were very obsequious to Felix, they gave false testimony. They claimed a legal arrest of Paul, when in reality it was more close to a lynching. They accused him of insurrection, Nope. They accused him of leading a sect called the Nazarenes. Well, kind of. Jesus was a Nazarene, so after all, Jesus. And they accused him of defiling the temple. Again, no. Then Felix invited Paul to testify, and one by one, he disputed the charges against him, and then he said this in chapter 23, verse 14, "This I admit to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our ancestors, believing everything laid down according to the law or written in the prophets. I have a hope in God, a hope that they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. Therefore, I do my best always to have a clear conscience toward God and all people." You see, Paul was willing to stand with God and against the religion of his childhood. Paul was willing to stand with God and against the rule of the most powerful empire the world has known. Paul now stood between Jerusalem and Rome, knowing that it was God who had called him to this place. Jerusalem, Rome, rock, hard place, jets, sharks, truth, justice, death, resurrection. Our present situation, again, is somewhat similar, isn't it? It's complicated, our present situation. It's complex. It's dangerous. And sometimes it is infuriating. We are lied to and about. We are faced with complex issues of history and science and religion and politics and falsehood and truth. And yet, no matter what, we have a call. And our call is not to stand with the lies. Our call is not to stand with the powers of the media, even if we draw our income from the media. Our call is not to draw our okayness from politics, but rather to stand between them with Jesus, our Lord and Savior, who says, everything's going to be all right. You've been good witnesses for me here in Jerusalem. Now you're going to be my witnesses in Rome. And as we do so, we recognize something from between vantage point. That between Jerusalem and Rome, and rock and hard place, and jets and sharks and frying pans and fire, and ham and anvil, devil, deep blue sea, a man and his lunch, truth and justice, death and resurrection, that really what we're between is two ferns. Right? We're really kind of between two ferns. Because all of those structures, all of those entities and the like, are little more than the ferns in Zach, and I have a hard time saying his last name, Galifianakis. Oh, I did that right. Well done. Satire of a show that took place between them. They only have the power that God gives them. Yes, it is true that Felix kept Paul under house arrest for 2 years. Let's see if I'm right. Yeah. No, go back to Zach Galifianakis. Felix kept Paul under house arrest for 2 years, and eventually Paul appealed to Rome. He was shipwrecked on his way there. He arrived in Rome, and when he did, he was able to preach at the center of the known world unhindered for 2 years. Yes, following that, he was almost certainly beheaded by Nero, but the word had been courageously preached. Rachel Held Evans, in her book Inspired that we've been reading on Wednesday night, says this. She says, the good news is that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah, sent to establish God's reign on earth, not through conquest, not through power and revenge like Rome, but through faithfulness, sacrifice, unconditional love. The kingdom of heaven is not some far-off future dream. It is here. Think about that. The kingdom of heaven is not some far-off future dream. It is where? Here, among us, made real by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus on earth as it is in heaven.